Pushing through the revolving door of a Horn and Hardart Automat, you could smell baked beans and fresh coffee before you reached the wall. Little glass doors with chrome knobs, each one holding something hot. A woman ahead of you dropped 2 nickels into the slot, turned the handle, and pulled out a plate of macaroni still steaming behind the glass. That was lunch in the 1950s, and by the time the drive-thrus took over, most of these meals were gone. Number 19 on this list sold so many portions that the kitchen ran out by noon. And number 3 on this list is the one meal that kept office workers coming back day after day. These were not convenience food. They were real meals, cooked from scratch by people you never saw, and they vanished the moment America chose speed over substance. So hit subscribe, because here are 25 forgotten Automat meals from the 1950s that vanished when fast food arrived. Number 25, tomato rice soup. This sat in the soup section of every Horn and Hardart Automat from the 1930s straight through the 1960s. A big bowl of stewed tomatoes, long grain rice, a little celery, and enough salt to make you forget it cost a dime. The rice was always cooked separately and added right before serving so it would not turn to mush, and that is a detail you will not find at any chain restaurant today. The broth had a sweetness from the tomatoes that balanced the salt, and it tasted better the longer it sat in those warm compartments behind the glass. It was the meal you bought when you had almost nothing in your pocket but still wanted something warm and filling. Office clerks, cab drivers, shop girls coming off their shifts, they all ordered this one, and not one of them would have called it fancy. It was just good. Number 24, the baked beans plate. Horn and Hardart's baked beans were a religion in Philadelphia. They slow-cooked them overnight with molasses, salt pork, and mustard, then loaded them into those little glass compartments first thing in the morning. By 10 o'clock, the line was already forming. A full plate with brown bread on the side cost 15 cents, and people ate this for lunch or supper without a second thought. The recipe never changed in decades because it never needed to. When the last Horn and Hardart closed in 1991, that recipe went with it, and nobody has come close to matching it since. Before I go further, for the folks who want recipes like these all gathered in one place, I have put together the Vintage Recipe Guide, available at my website vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not push it again in this video. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 23, Harvard Beets. Sliced beets in a sweet and sour sauce made from sugar, vinegar, cornstarch, and a little butter. Nobody ever proved the name was connected to the university, though people argued about it for decades. What mattered was that Automat served this as a hot plate, and people ordered it as a full lunch with a roll and a cup of coffee. The beets came out of the compartment already glistening, deep red and sticky, and the smell hit you before the door was all the way open. You either loved Harvard beets or you pushed the plate away. There was no middle ground. The sauce alone took about 20 minutes to make properly, and the kitchen crew kept fresh batches rotating through the compartments all afternoon. Today, you would be hard-pressed to find Harvard beets on any menu in the country, and most people under 50 have never even heard of them. Number 22, corn chowder. Thick and creamy, built on salt pork, diced potatoes, corn kernels, and whole milk. Not cream of corn from a can. Real corn chowder with chunks you could feel on your spoon. Automats in the Northeast served this from September through March, and it was the kind of bowl you wrapped both hands around when the weather turned. A 5-cent cup could hold you together until supper. The potatoes were cut rough, the corn still had a little crunch to it, and the broth carried that fatty, smoky edge from the salt pork. You could eat it with crackers or just drink it straight from the bowl, and either way, it was the cheapest hot meal in the building. Fast food soup stations never picked this one up because it took too long to make properly, and the powdered versions that came later tasted like nothing at all. Number 21, knockwurst and sauerkraut. A fat, garlic-heavy knockwurst split down the middle and served on a plate with a pile of warm sauerkraut and a smear of brown mustard. This was a working man's lunch in every Automat from Midtown to South Philadelphia. The casing had a snap to it when you bit through, and the kraut was always tangy, never sweet. You ate it with a fork, not your hands, and it came with a roll you used to mop up the mustard at the end. German-American cooking at its most direct, and the Automat was one of the last places in the city where you could still get it served properly on a plate with a knife and fork. The old-timers ordered this without looking at anything else on the wall. When the Automats closed, the knockwurst plate went with them because no fast food chain had any interest in sauerkraut or anything you needed silverware to eat. The Automat was not a restaurant. It was a wall. You did not sit down and wait for someone to take your order. You stood in front of rows of glass compartments, each one about the size of a mailbox, and you chose your meal the way you chose a candy bar from a vending machine. Drop the coins in, turn the knob, pull the door open. Behind that wall, in a kitchen you never saw, real cooks were making real food. Whole turkeys went into ovens back there. Soups simmered in 60-gallon kettles. Women rolled pie crust by hand every single morning. The genius of the Automat was that it gave you cafeteria speed without cafeteria shame. You served yourself, but you ate a proper meal on a real plate, and nobody rushed you out the door. Number 20, turkey croquettes. Automats went through enormous amounts of roasted turkey, and whatever was left at the end of the day got ground up, mixed with a thick white sauce, shaped into cylinders, breaded, and fried the next morning. The inside was creamy and rich and tasted like Thanksgiving leftovers pressed into a stick. The outside had a golden crust that shattered when you cut into it with a fork. They came 2 per plate with gravy on the side and a scoop of mashed potatoes. For 20 cents, you had a full hot lunch made from real roasted turkey, not a processed patty shaped to look like one. Turkey croquettes required fresh roasted birds and hand rolling, and when the Automats closed, nobody else was willing to do that work. Number 19, chicken croquettes. This was Horn and Hardart's single best-selling item for years. They made so many of these on any given day that the kitchen crew started rolling them before dawn, and on a busy afternoon, the compartments were empty by noon. The recipe was straightforward. Cooked chicken, usually dark meat because it had more flavor, was pulled from the bone, chopped fine, and folded into a thick bechamel sauce with a touch of nutmeg and white pepper. The mixture went into the icebox to firm up overnight, then was shaped into oval logs, rolled through flour, dipped in egg wash, coated in fine breadcrumbs, and fried in clean oil until the crust turned the color of a new penny. They came 2 to a plate with a pool of chicken gravy and a side of creamed peas, and they cost $0.25. The inside was soft, almost custard-like, and the crust held everything together until you broke through it with your fork. People lined up for chicken croquettes the way people today stand in line for the newest gadget. The difference is that a chicken croquette actually fed you. Horn and Hardart reportedly served more chicken croquettes in a single day across their locations than many sit-down restaurants served of their entire menu in a week. When the company shuttered its last location, the chicken croquette effectively disappeared from American dining. You can still find versions at a few old hotel restaurants, but the Automat version, the one fried to order and sitting behind that glass door still sizzling, that one is gone for good. Number 18, Swedish meatballs with egg noodles. Small, round meatballs made from a mix of ground beef and pork, seasoned with allspice and a touch of nutmeg, browned in butter, and simmered in a cream gravy until they were tender all the way through. The noodles underneath soaked up every drop of that gravy. Automats served this because it was cheap to make in volume and it traveled well through the compartment system without falling apart. The meatballs held their shape, the gravy kept them warm, and the price kept people coming back. You could get 6 meatballs on a plate for 15 cents, and every one of them was rolled by hand in the back kitchen that morning. This was a plate that felt like a home-cooked Tuesday night supper, and it disappeared when meatballs became something you bought frozen in a plastic bag at the supermarket. Number 17, cheese blintzes. Thin crepes filled with sweetened farmer cheese, folded into rectangles, and pan-fried in butter until the edges crisped up golden. Automats in New York City served these with a dollop of sour cream, and they sold as fast as the kitchen could fill the compartments. The cheese inside was mild and slightly sweet, almost like ricotta, but drier, and the crepe itself was barely thicker than paper. This was Eastern European food that had crossed the Atlantic with immigrant families and landed behind a glass door in Midtown Manhattan. a complete meal for a dime, and one of the most popular items in the building on any given morning. Women on their lunch breaks ordered 2 at a time and ate them standing at the counter. Cheese blintzes retreated to a handful of Jewish delis when the automats closed, and most Americans under 60 have never tasted one. Number 16. Creamed mushrooms on toast. Fresh button mushrooms sliced thick, sautéed in butter, and folded into a cream sauce with a little flour, whole milk, and thyme. The whole thing was ladled over 2 slices of toasted white bread and served on a plate. This was a meatless meal before anyone had a word for it. You ordered it when you did not feel like meat, and nobody questioned it. The mushrooms were earthy and rich, the sauce thick enough to stay on the toast without making it soggy, and the entire plate cost less than a Subway token. Automats treated this like a real meal, not an afterthought, and the people who ordered it came back for it week after week. It was honest food that respected the ingredient. Fast food never bothered with mushrooms at all, and when the automats closed, creamed mushrooms on toast went with them. Number 15. Split pea soup with ham. Dense and olive-colored, this was made from dried split peas cooked down with a ham bone, diced carrots, celery, and onion until the whole pot turned thick enough to hold a spoon upright. The ham was not an afterthought. Real chunks of smoked ham floated in every bowl, and the smoky flavor ran all the way through. Automats sold this from chrome-trimmed dispensers, and on a cold January afternoon in Philadelphia, you would see a line forming just for this one item. It was filling, it was cheap, and it tasted like somebody's kitchen. The chain soup counters that came later used powdered mixes and hot water. You could taste the difference from across the room, and so could everybody who remembered the real thing. When the first McDonald's franchises spread across the country in the early 1960s, nobody called it the end of anything. It looked like the beginning. Faster service, lower prices, a hamburger in a paper wrapper you could eat in your car. What nobody noticed at the time was what got left behind. The automat did not just sell food, it sold a kind of dignity. A woman eating alone at an automat was not pitied, she was just eating. A man on a tight budget could sit in a clean, well-lit room and have a hot meal on a real plate without anyone knowing what he could or could not afford. The drive-thrus took the plate away, put the food in a bag, and told you to eat somewhere else. That was the trade, and most people did not realize they had made it until the automats were already gone. Number 14. Veal cutlet with brown gravy. Pounded thin and dusted with seasoned flour, the veal was fried in a skillet until the crust went golden. The gravy came from the pan drippings, a splash of beef stock, and a little flour to thicken it up. The cutlet sat on a plate with mashed potatoes on one side and green beans on the other, and the gravy went over everything. This looked like Sunday dinner at home, and it cost about 35 cents at most automats in the mid-1950s. The veal was always cut thin, which meant it cooked fast and stayed tender, and the breading gave it enough structure to hold up under all that gravy. Horn and Hardart offered this as one of their premium plates, the kind that rotated through the compartments once or twice a week rather than every day. The regulars knew exactly which days it showed up. They would walk in, check the wall, and if the veal cutlet was sitting there behind the glass, nothing else mattered. Veal started falling out of fashion in the 1970s as prices climbed and tastes changed, but the automat version had already disappeared by then. The fast food chains that replaced the automats had no use for a breaded veal cutlet. It needed a plate, it needed gravy, it needed a knife and fork. Everything about it was incompatible with a paper wrapper and a drive-through window. So it simply went away, and a whole generation of people who grew up eating veal cutlets at the automat never found anything to replace it. Number 13. Chicken fricassee. Bone-in chicken pieces braised low and slow in a white sauce built from butter, flour, chicken stock, and a bay leaf or two. The meat fell off the bone, and the sauce was pale, thick, and quiet in the way that old French-American cooking always was. No kick to it, no flash. But it was warm and deeply savory, and it filled your stomach for hours. Automats served this over rice or alongside boiled potatoes, and it was the kind of plate that grandmothers nodded at with approval. You ate it with a spoon because the sauce was too good to leave behind. Chicken fricassee required patience, and patience was exactly what the fast food industry decided it could not afford. By the late 1960s, it was already fading from Automat menus, and today most people have never heard the word. Number 12. Lamb stew. Shoulder lamb cut into chunks, browned hard, and simmered with potatoes, carrots, turnips, and pearl onions in a thin broth seasoned with rosemary and black pepper. Automats in the Northeast served this from October through April, and it was cold weather food in the truest sense. Lamb was cheaper than beef in the 1950s, and most working families ate it without thinking twice. The stew sat behind the glass doors in deep bowls, and the steam fogged the compartment window from the inside. You grabbed it fast because there were only so many portions each day. It was brown, it was hot, and it stuck to your ribs. The meat had that slightly gamey flavor that some people loved and others had to learn to appreciate, but at the Automat, nobody questioned it. Lamb stew has essentially vanished from everyday American cooking, and no chain restaurant serves it anymore. Number 11. Shepherd's pie. Ground lamb mixed with peas, carrots, and onions in a thick gravy, spooned into a baking dish and topped with a layer of mashed potatoes browned under a broiler until the peaks turned crispy. Automats served these in individual portions that came out of the compartment piping hot, and the top was always a little darker on one side, where it had been closest to the heat. This was British-American pub food that had been adopted by the Automat kitchen because it was sturdy, cheap, and held its quality in a warm compartment for half an hour without suffering. You ate it with a fork and nothing else. No bread, no side dish, just the pie and a cup of coffee. When the Automats closed, Shepherd's pie retreated to a handful of Irish pubs and has barely been seen in public since. Number 10. Corned beef on rye. Thick sliced corned beef piled on fresh rye bread with a swipe of brown mustard. No lettuce, no tomato, no nonsense. This was a New York Automat sandwich in its purest form. The corned beef was brined and slow-cooked in the back kitchen, sliced by hand, and stacked high enough that you had to press the sandwich down to fit it through the little glass door. A dime's worth of meat between two slices of good bread, and it was better than most deli sandwiches you would pay several dollars for today. Automats could sell this cheaply because they cut out the counterman and the wait. You just grabbed it and sat down. The corned beef sandwich disappeared from Automats because the meat takes hours to cure and cook, and the entire fast food model runs on minutes. Behind every Automat wall was a kitchen full of people you never met. Women who showed up at 4 in the morning to roll pie dough and chop onions. Men who stood over deep fryers for 8-hour shifts without sitting down. They were paid hourly, and many of them stayed for years because the work was steady and the kitchen was clean. Horn and Hardart employed thousands of cooks, bakers, and prep workers across their locations, and a large number of them were black women who had migrated north from the Carolinas and Virginia looking for stable, dignified work. These were not assembly line jobs. Every plate that went behind a glass door was cooked and arranged by hand. When the Automats closed, those jobs disappeared almost overnight, and the people who held them had to start over in an industry that no longer valued what they knew how to do. Number 9. Fish cakes with tartar sauce. Flaked cod mixed with mashed potatoes, a beaten egg, minced onion, and a pinch of cayenne, shaped into thick rounds and fried until both sides turned brown and crispy. The tartar sauce was made in the back kitchen from real mayonnaise, chopped pickles, capers, and a squeeze of lemon. Automats served 2 fish cakes per plate with coleslaw on the side, and on Fridays the Catholic lunch crowd cleared them out before noon. This was a Friday staple in every Automat in the Northeast, and it cost about the same as a bowl of soup. The crust had a salty crunch to it, and the inside was soft and flaky, barely holding together when you cut through it. Fish cakes required fresh cod and hand mixing, and when the Automats closed, that kind of labor stopped making economic sense. Nobody in the fast food business was going to flake cod by hand for a 15-cent plate. Number 8. Vegetable beef soup. Chuck beef cut into small cubes and simmered all morning with potatoes, green beans, corn, tomatoes, celery, and onion in a broth that had been on the stove since before sunrise. This was a bowl of soup with more substance than most stews sold under that name today. The vegetables held their shape, the beef was tender enough to pull apart with a spoon, and the broth had that deep amber color that only comes from hours on a low flame. Automats served it in thick ceramic bowls, and you could see the steam curling through the glass compartment door. A bowl and a roll was a full meal for a working person. Chain restaurants later replaced this with something from a can heated in a microwave, and everybody knew it. Number 7. Chicken pot pie. Deep, golden, and heavy enough that you felt the weight of it when you lifted the plate off the shelf. A single-serving pie with a flaky top crust and a filling made from chunks of chicken breast, diced carrots, green peas, pearl onions, and a thick cream sauce seasoned with thyme and white pepper. The Automat version was baked fresh every morning and loaded into the compartments while still warm. When you pulled one out, the crust was golden, and the filling bubbled where it had leaked through at the edges. The dough was made from scratch, the chicken was roasted and pulled, and the cream sauce was built from a proper roux. Each pie was about the size of a cereal bowl, one pie and a glass of milk, and you were set for the afternoon. A fast food chicken sandwich is not even in the same conversation. Number 6. Baked ham with pineapple ring. A thick slice of cured ham glazed with brown sugar and studded with whole cloves, baked until the edges caramelized, and served with a single ring of pineapple on top. This was Automat elegance. It sat behind the glass looking like a holiday plate, and people ordered it when they wanted to feel like they were eating something special on a Wednesday afternoon. The ham was salty and sweet at once, and the pineapple ring added just enough acidity to cut through the richness. It came with scalloped potatoes or green beans, depending on the location, and it was one of the pricier plates on the wall, usually around 40 cents. Still cheaper than any sit-down restaurant in the neighborhood. Baked ham with pineapple disappeared because it required a real oven and real timing, and the fast food model had no room for either. Number 5. Clam chowder. The New England kind, thick and white, made from chopped clams, diced potatoes, onions, salt pork, and heavy cream. Automats in New York served this year-round, but it hit hardest in the winter months when a cup of chowder could warm you through a crosstown walk in the cold. The clams were chopped in the back kitchen, not scooped from a can, and the cream was whole and rich. Little flecks of black pepper floated on the surface, and the potatoes were just soft enough to break apart when your spoon pushed through them. A bowl and a handful of oyster crackers, and you did not need anything else for the rest of the afternoon. Horn and Hardart's clam chowder was considered one of the best in the city, and when they closed, the recipe went into a vault that nobody has opened since. Number 4. Beef barley soup. Cubes of stew beef, pearl barley, carrots, celery, and onions simmered for hours in a dark beef broth until the barley swelled up and the meat started to shred at the edges. This was a soup that turned into a meal by sheer density. The barley thickened the broth to the point where it was practically gravy, and every spoonful had something solid in it. No broth-only bites. You worked your way through the whole bowl, and by the end you did not need anything else. Automats kept a fresh pot going from early morning until close, and the regulars timed their visits to catch it at its thickest, right around 2 in the afternoon when the barley had absorbed half the broth. Beef barley soup was one of those things that fast food could not replicate because it demanded the one ingredient the new industry refused to use: time. Number 3. Beef pot pie. Similar in construction to the chicken version, but deeper in flavor and darker in color. Chunks of braised beef, potatoes, carrots, and peas in a thick brown gravy, all sealed under a round of golden pastry. The beef had been cooking for hours before it went into the pie, and the gravy was made from the braising liquid, which gave every bite that slow-cooked richness you cannot get from a shortcut. The pastry cracked when you pressed your fork through it, and the steam that escaped smelled like a kitchen that had been working since dawn. Office workers across Manhattan came back to the Automat for this one plate day after day, and many of them never ordered anything else. When the Automats folded, the beef pot pie did not move to fast food. It did not move anywhere. It simply disappeared from daily American life, and most people under 50 have never eaten one made from scratch. Number 2. The creamed spinach plate. Horn and Hardart's creamed spinach was famous across 2 cities. Fresh spinach cooked down, chopped fine, and folded into a sauce made from butter, flour, whole milk, and a touch of nutmeg. The color was deep green, the texture was smooth, and it came on a plate with a hard-boiled egg sliced in half sitting right on top. That was the whole meal. Spinach, egg, and a roll. People who ate at the Automat regularly knew this was one of the best things behind the glass, and they ordered it without hesitation. It was cheap, it was filling, and it tasted like someone's mother had made it that morning. No fast food chain ever tried to replicate it because nobody in the drive-through business believed you could sell spinach to the American public. They were wrong, but by then, the Automats were already gone. Number 1. Macaroni and cheese. Horn and Hardart baked their macaroni and cheese in massive sheet pans, cut it into squares, and slid each portion behind a glass door while it was still bubbling. The recipe called for elbow macaroni, sharp cheddar, whole milk, eggs, butter, and a dusting of dry mustard. Nothing more. The top was browned and slightly crispy, and the inside was dense and creamy in the way that only baked macaroni can be. It cost a nickel in the 1940s and about a dime by 1955, and at that price it was the most popular single item in the building. Secretaries ate it. Cab drivers ate it. Families with small children split 2 squares between 4 people and called it supper. It was the one meal that crossed every line of class and neighborhood and age. When the Automat closed, macaroni and cheese survived in boxes and freezer aisles, but the baked version, the one made with real eggs and sharp cheddar and served in a square on a real plate, that version is gone. And nothing wrapped in paper from a drive-through has ever come close. Number 24. Creamed chipped beef on toast. The soldiers called it SOS. Thin slices of dried beef torn into strips, stirred into a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, then spooned over toast. The Army had been serving it since 1910, and when those soldiers came home after World War II, they wanted it at their local diner. A plate with hash browns on the side cost 60 cents in 1955. By the 1970s, it had become a breakfast staple across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. Diners in Delaware and Maryland built entire reputations around their version. The beef was salty, the sauce was thick. The toast went from crispy to soft as it absorbed the gravy. It filled you for 5 hours on 40 cents worth of ingredients. When diners started closing in the 1980s, creamed chipped beef went with them. A generation of veterans lost the last place that still cooked the way the mess hall did. The porcupine meatball looked like a trick and worked like one. Mix ground beef with raw, uncooked rice, dry, straight from the bag, shape into balls, drop into a pot with condensed tomato soup and half a can of water, lid on, simmer 45 minutes. What emerged had rice grains poking through the surface on every side like quills, cooked entirely inside the meat, each grain swollen and soft. The technique came from Depression-era cooks who found that raw rice in a meatball stretched the meat further while adding a texture nothing else could replicate, and it appeared in Betty Crocker's picture cookbook in 1950, one of the best-selling cookbooks in American history. By the 1960s, it was in every budget cookbook in America, recommended for one-person cooking. A half recipe made 3 or 4 meatballs, a complete solo dinner in its own sauce. The trick was leaving the lid completely alone for the full 45 minutes. The people who knew the recipe had been shown how. Everyone else lifted the lid early and wondered why the rice was still crunchy. Cheesy chicken and hash brown casserole arrived when the freezer section became a pantry. Frozen shredded hash browns, the bag in the bottom of the freezer since the last big breakfast, were the entire starch, tumbled into a dish still partly frozen, then covered with shredded rotisserie chicken, sour cream, cream of chicken soup, shredded cheddar, and salt. No pre-cooking, no thawing, no browning. $3.50 for an hour. The hash browns cooked in steam from the sour cream and soup. The chicken absorbed the potato fat, and the cheddar went crispy at the edges. Through the 1970s, as frozen foods became standard pantry items, this assembly cooking replaced the labor of peeling and slicing that earlier potato casseroles required. She probably learned it from a church cookbook or the back of the Ore-Ida bag, and once she did, She never went back to fresh potatoes. That version, the easy one done in 10 minutes flat, is the one you remember, and she is not here to make it anymore. Number 19. Corned beef hash. A diner cook in Brooklyn named Frank Moretti used to make his hash from scratch every morning at 4 a.m. He chopped leftover corned beef by hand, diced potatoes, cooked the whole thing on a flat-top grill until the bottom formed a dark, crispy crust, then flipped it. 2 eggs on top, sunny side up, toast on the side. $1.40 in 1972. The crust was everything. That shattering crunch when you broke through with a fork, followed by the soft, salty, peppery interior. But canned corned beef hash killed it. The canned version was mush. No crust, no texture, no soul. Diner owners switched because it was faster, and customers noticed and stopped ordering. By the time a new generation discovered brunch, corned beef hash was already a memory. Potato soup asked nothing and gave back more than seemed fair. 2 potatoes, 1 onion, water to cover, salt, 20 minutes on the back burner. When the potatoes softened, you added milk, butter, a heavy grind of black pepper. The move no cookbook explained well. Mash a few pieces against the side of the pot while leaving the rest in chunks so the broth thickened without going smooth, and every spoonful had something to bite. It cost under 20 cents in the early 1960s. It was the soup of people living alone after something: a divorce, a death, a child who left and took all the noise. You made it because it filled the kitchen with a plain, honest smell and fed you without requiring thought. She made it every winter. You knew that version by heart, the way she never once measured the milk. The version you make now is close. Every time you sit down alone with it, close is not the same thing. She saved the cream of celery for pork. That was the division she had settled on. Cream of mushroom went with chicken. Cream of celery went with pork. And if you used the wrong one, she would notice and say nothing, and you would know. Thick-cut pork chops into the dish without browning, only a light salt, the undiluted cream of celery spread over each chop like a blanket. Dried onion flakes, paprika, foil tight. Baked at 325 for 90 minutes, low enough that the connective tissue dissolved and the collagen seeped into the soup until it thickened toward gravy. The pork chops sold today are leaner and dry out at that temperature, which is part of why nobody makes this the way she made it. The other part is simpler. She is gone. The unwritten rule about which soup went with which meat went with her, and nobody thought to ask until it was already too late. Number 15. Welsh rarebit. Most Americans alive today have never heard of this. From the 1890s through the 1950s, Welsh rarebit was on the menu of nearly every lunch counter, tavern, and diner in the Northeast. Sharp cheddar melted with beer, mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and a pinch of cayenne poured over thick toast. That was the whole thing. Cheese on toast elevated to something almost elegant. A plate cost 50 cents in 1950. The sauce had a sharpness from the mustard and a depth from the beer that made it taste like it belonged in a restaurant, not a diner. That was the beauty of it. Diner food at its best was restaurant food stripped of pretension. When grilled cheese sandwiches became the default comfort food, Welsh rarebit disappeared. The name confused people. The beer and the sauce scared teetotalers. A dish that had been feeding Americans for 60 years simply vanished because nobody bothered to explain what it was. The box of rice-a-roni had been in American cabinets since 1958, and by the early 1960s, it had become the standard dinner for anyone cooking alone who wanted something that felt more like cooking than it was. The technique was everything. Melt butter in the skillet, add the dry rice and broken vermicelli from the box, and toast them together, stirring constantly until the pasta turned amber and the rice went translucent. Then water, then the seasoning packet, lid on, heat down. Those 2 minutes of dry toasting gave the dish a nutty depth that plain boiled rice never had. The step people who didn't know the rule always skipped, wondering later why theirs tasted flat. Golden Grain Company developed the original in San Francisco after co-founder Vince DeDomenico watched a neighbor combine rice and pasta in the early 1950s. 19 cents a box. You could eat it plain. You could pull in a leftover chicken thigh and call it a proper dinner. Either way, it was ready before you finished changing out of your work clothes. Before a mandolin appeared in any kitchen you ever stood in, there was a sharp knife and patient slicing, because the thinner the potato, the more surface there was to absorb the sauce, and the more surface, the better the dish. Ham and scalloped potatoes did not come from a cookbook. They came from the Monday after Easter, when half a bone-in ham still sat in the refrigerator. Thin sliced potatoes first, diced ham and sliced onion, a second potato layer, then a simple roux sauce, butter and flour, then whole milk whisked until thick, salt and black pepper. Covered low for an hour, uncovered for the last 20 minutes to brown. The rule: if the knife passed through the top layer without resistance, it was done. No thermometer, just the knife. By the 1940s and 50s, this was one of the most reproduced casseroles in Midwestern home economics programs, a model of cost-efficient protein extension that turned a weekend ham into a weeknight centerpiece without either losing dignity. Number 20. The tuna melt. Rye bread, tuna salad mixed with mayonnaise and diced celery, a thick slice of Swiss cheese melted under the broiler until it bubbled and browned. Pickles on the side. That was the whole production. A tuna melt at a lunch counter cost 85 cents in 1968. Secretaries ordered it. School teachers ordered it. Construction workers ordered it and asked for extra cheese. The rye bread gave it depth. The melted Swiss gave it richness. And the tuna salad, cold against the warm bread, created a contrast that no modern sandwich has managed to replicate. Diners replaced it with wraps and paninis in the 1990s. The tuna melt did not disappear because people stopped liking it. It disappeared because restaurants stopped believing that simple food deserved a place on the menu. The can of corned beef hash told you nothing useful. Dense, brick red, smelling faintly of iron. Anyone meeting it for the first time would have reservations. The people who knew it understood one rule: put it in the skillet and leave it alone. Crumble in with diced onion, spread flat, press lightly, and abandon for 8 full minutes while a dark crust builds on the bottom. Turn once, one time only, let the other side catch. With an egg on top, it was a complete dinner for under a quarter. Armour was the standard, about 19 cents a can in the 1960s. The men who lived on it, the widowers, the newly divorced, the ones on a hot plate in a furnished room, would tell you it tasted fine. Some would tell you it tasted exactly like getting through the week. The egg on top was what made it worth sitting down for. Creamed dried beef had a nickname men who'd served never quite stopped using. Unsuitable for cookbooks, but right at home in kitchens where someone had learned to cook on a military budget. The recipe: a small jar of Armour dried beef soaked briefly in cold water to pull back the salt, torn into pieces, folded into a white sauce of butter, flour, and milk, black pepper, ladled over toast. The toast had to be properly done, golden, not pale, because the sauce soaked through soft bread in 40 seconds flat, and everyone who'd made it more than once knew to watch the toaster. The jar cost about 20 cents. The flour and milk cost almost nothing. It was the meal of men who'd come home from service and never quite returned to spending money the way civilians did, carrying a wartime economy through the 1950s and into the 60s on a budget that existed only in their own kitchens. The jars have retreated to specialty shelves now, waiting for someone who still knows what they're for. Nobody outside the South knew what poppy seed chicken was, and that was part of how you knew you were in the right kitchen. Cooked chicken, shredded, never cubed, went into a baking dish, then a mixture of sour cream and cream of chicken soup poured over it, smooth and thick. Over the top went a full sleeve of crushed Ritz crackers mixed with melted butter and a tablespoon of poppy seeds pressed lightly into the cracker surface, baked until the crust went deep gold and the cream filling was bubbling at the edges. The poppy seeds are not for flavor. They are for texture and identity, and anyone who skips them has never made this the right way. The recipe circulated through Southern church suppers and community cookbooks throughout the 1960s, passed hand to hand without a printed name. She made it every time someone in the congregation was sick or grieving or had a new baby. You ate it at her table and never thought to write it down, and when she stopped bringing it, nobody could remember what had gone into it. Number 22. The hot, open-faced turkey sandwich. This was Thanksgiving on a plate for $1.25. 2 slices of roasted turkey laid across a piece of white bread covered in brown gravy, with a scoop of mashed potatoes on the side. Woolworths served this at every one of their 1,950 lunch counters in 1964. Howard Johnson's had a version. So did every truck stop along Route 66. The bread soaked up the gravy and became something between stuffing and a dumpling. The turkey was sliced from an actual roast, not pressed deli meat. The gravy was made from drippings, not a packet. For a man working a double shift at the factory, this was the closest thing to a home-cooked meal he would eat all week. Diners dropped it because carving a turkey every morning took labor. Pre-sliced deli turkey did not taste the same, so instead of adapting, they just removed it from the board. Welsh Rarebit, the name that made it sound like it required a hunting license, was sharp cheddar melted with Worcestershire sauce, dry mustard, and a splash of dark beer or milk poured over toast. The dish had been an English tavern staple since the 18th century, appearing in cookbooks as Welsh Rabbit as early as 1725, and crossed into American kitchens as a dignified supper for the person who had cheese, bread, and little else. In the 1960s, it still appeared in Good Housekeeping as a savory, sophisticated but cheap. The trick nobody figured out alone. Heat had to stay low and the cheese stirred constantly, never boiling, or the sauce broke into a greasy slick and a rubbery lump. You learned this once by ruining it. Then you never forgot the temperature. The people who made Rarebit well had been shown at the stove by someone who'd also been shown, the recipe passing hand to hand, not page to page, until the line of hands ran out and the dish quietly stopped showing up on Tuesday nights. There was no announcement. It just stopped. The smell hit the hallway before you reached the kitchen. Kielbasa and sauerkraut in a hot oven produce a sharp, smoky smell that is not polite and not quiet. Central European immigrant families brought kielbasa into American working-class neighborhoods in the early 20th century. Polish, Slovak, Czech households in mill towns from Pennsylvania to Ohio, and the combination of smoked sausage with fermented cabbage and potato was centuries old before it ever crossed an ocean. The method is simple. Kielbasa coins, drained sauerkraut, chunked potatoes, brown sugar, mustard, oil, all tossed and spread across one pan. 400 degrees, 30 minutes. The brown sugar tames the fermented bite, the potato soaks up sausage fat, and the whole thing goes from pungent and sharp to sweet and tender. Precisely why this dish outlasted the neighborhoods that invented it. The mill towns emptied. The kielbasa stayed. Number 17, chicken a la king on toast. Chunks of chicken in a thick cream sauce with mushrooms, peas, and diced pimientos served over toast points or a split biscuit. This was hotel food that migrated to the diner counter in the 1940s and stayed there for 30 years. The diner version was made from scratch, real chicken pulled from the bone, a roux built with butter and flour, cream stirred in slowly until the sauce coated the back of a spoon. A plate cost 95 cents in 1962. It was the meal that waitresses recommended when you could not decide. Rich, warm, and filling without being heavy. The pimientos gave it color. The peas gave it sweetness. When diners stopped making sauces from scratch, chicken a la king was one of the first casualties. Egg foo young was the exotic dinner you made for pennies, the meal that let someone in a studio apartment feel, briefly, like the takeout window was open just for them. The recipe appeared in 1960s cookbooks everywhere, Better Homes and Gardens, Betty Crocker, women's magazines, because Chinese American food had become something home cooks wanted to approximate without going out. Beat eggs with drained canned bean sprouts, sliced scallions, a spoonful of soy sauce, and whatever cooked chicken sat in the refrigerator, then fry small patties in oil until the bottoms browned. The brown gravy, beef broth thickened with cornstarch, a little soy for color, went poured over the top. The dish had roots in Cantonese cooking, but the American home version was its own invention, softer and adapted to whatever the cabinet held. The women who made it wrote the recipe on index cards and gave copies to their daughters. Most of those cards are in junk drawers now, ink faded past reading. The secret was the raw beef. Recipes that had you brown the ground beef first missed the point. The logic depended on the fat rendering directly into the macaroni and tomato sauce as everything cooked together, binding the pasta in the drippings. Dry, uncooked elbow macaroni first, then raw ground beef crumbled over it, then canned diced tomatoes, then beef broth, just enough to submerge the pasta, then shredded cheddar across the surface. Tight foil, 350, 45 minutes, then uncovered for 10 more to set the cheese. Campbell's published an emergency dinner pamphlet in the 1950s built on this exact principle. Raw starch and raw protein combined with liquid in a sealed dish, which became the organizing idea of American post-war convenience cooking. The broth turns the macaroni translucent where it has not yet absorbed. The beef fat marbles through the pasta, and the cheddar goes slightly crisp at the edges. You pull back the foil and the kitchen smells like a diner in 1957. Number 23, liver and onions. Nobody under 40 orders this anymore. That is not an exaggeration. From the 1940s through the 1970s, liver and onions was on every diner menu in the country. A thick slice of calf liver, seared on the flat top until the edges crisped, buried under a pile of caramelized onions, served with mashed potatoes and gravy. It cooked in 4 minutes. It cost the diner almost nothing. Truck drivers ordered it because it was fast, and nurses ordered it after double shifts because their doctors told them to. A plate cost 75 cents in 1960 and $1.50 by 1975. The flavor was strong, mineral, almost metallic. The onions were there to soften that edge. When America decided it did not like organ meat anymore, liver and onions vanished from menus almost overnight. Whole generations grew up never knowing what it tasted like. Before Hamburger Helper arrived in 1971, people stretching ground beef into a full dinner were already doing it themselves. And in New England, they'd called the result American chop suey for decades, a name with nothing to do with Chinese food and everything to do with the Depression-era habit of giving humble dishes whatever label made dinner sound more interesting. Brown the beef with diced onion, pour in undiluted Campbell's tomato soup and a can of water, bring to a simmer, drop in dry elbow macaroni right in the skillet, stir for 20 minutes. The Encyclopedia of American Food and Drink traces chop suey in American usage to the late 19th century, but the elbow mac version became the signature of New England working-class cooking in the post-war years. The Midwest called it American goulash. Parts of the South called it macaroni red. It fed whoever needed feeding, by whatever name, and left the pot easy to wash. When cooking alone, that mattered almost as much as the eating. Chicken divan began as the signature dish of the Divan Parisienne restaurant in New York City's Chatham Hotel, created by a chef named Anthony Lagasse in the early 20th century. Layered chicken and broccoli in a rich cream sauce served as the restaurant's centerpiece. By the late 1950s, home cooks had rebuilt it from what was on hand: frozen broccoli, leftover chicken, cream of chicken soup, mayonnaise, lemon juice, a teaspoon of curry powder, and cheddar across the top. The restaurant version called for a scratch bechamel. The home version needed a can opener and 30 minutes, and it tasted as though someone had genuinely tried. Frozen broccoli in one layer, cooked chicken over that, the soup and mayonnaise mixture poured over everything, cheddar on top, 350 until golden and bubbling. The curry powder is the thing most people skip, which is why their version never quite lands. She did not skip it. She knew what a single teaspoon did to a cream sauce, added it without measuring, and you never knew it was there until she was not making it anymore. Number 18, chicken fried steak. Take a tough, cheap cut of beef, pound it flat with a mallet, dredge it in seasoned flour, dip it in egg, dredge it again, and fry it in a cast iron skillet until the coating shatters at the touch of a fork. Then smother the whole thing in white pepper gravy. This was the blue plate special across Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and most of the rural South from the 1930s through the 1980s. A full plate cost $1.15 in 1965. The steak itself was round steak or cube steak, the cheapest cuts at the butcher counter, often less than 50 cents a pound. The breading and the gravy turned something tough into something extraordinary. That was the entire philosophy of diner cooking. You did not start with good ingredients. You started with cheap ingredients and made them good through technique and patience. Chicken fried steak was the purest expression of that idea. It took a cut of beef that nobody wanted, wrapped it in seasoned flour, and turned it into something worth driving 20 miles for. Truck stops across the Great Plains built their reputations on this single dish. When those truck stops closed and chains moved in, the chicken fried steak came pre-breaded and frozen. The gravy came from a packet. And the whole point of the meal, the transformation of something cheap into something magnificent, was lost. If rice-a-roni was what you made when the cabinet was stocked, cream of mushroom pork chops was what you made when the refrigerator held exactly one pork chop and a single can of Campbell's. Season the chop, brown it in butter, move it to a baking dish, pour the condensed soup directly over the top, undiluted, straight from the can, and bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The steam and the meat's own moisture thinned the soup to a sauce, and the chop came out tender, sitting in a pale gravy you mopped up with bread. Campbell's had been suggesting this combination since the early 1950s, and by the 1960s it appeared in household recipe files under names like Company Pork Chops, even when the only company was the cook. The knowledge that one can and 30 minutes could turn a thin pork chop into something genuinely good traveled neighbor to neighbor over back fences, written on cards, shared in parish newsletters. Then it just stopped being passed. It sounds like a mistake until you eat it. Apricot jam and dry onion soup mix poured over raw chicken pieces and nothing else. No broth, no extra seasoning. The jam melts and spreads thin across the skin, and the dehydrated onion blooms in the moisture the meat releases. By the 40-minute mark, the dish has lacquered itself, the jam reducing to something close to a restaurant glaze, the chicken underneath bronze and pull-apart tender. The sweet and savory logic, fruit with poultry balanced by salt, is as old as medieval European cooking. But nobody at the counter with a jar of Smuckers and a packet of Lipton was thinking about that. They were thinking about dinner, and what they landed on tasted like more effort than it was. The dish arrived in American kitchens through the 1970s and 80s, when shelf-stable condiments made complicated-tasting meals possible without anything being fresh. Open two things, pour them over chicken, and sit down to something that looked like you meant it. Number 21. Salisbury steak. Dr. James Salisbury invented this during the Civil War. He was convinced that ground beef, formed into a patty and cooked in gravy, could cure everything from heart disease to tuberculosis. He was wrong about the medicine. He was right about the meal. A Salisbury steak at a diner was a hand-formed beef patty, seared in a skillet, then smothered in mushroom gravy and served with mashed potatoes. It cost 90 cents in 1965. The gravy turned a simple beef patty into something that tasted like your mother had spent an hour at the stove. By the 1980s, Swanson had reduced it to a frozen TV dinner that tasted like cardboard compared to the real thing. The diner version died because the frozen version was cheaper and faster. America chose convenience over flavor, and an entire dish paid the price. Tamale pie was what you made when ground beef and a can of beans needed to become something that actually felt like dinner. Brown the beef with onion and garlic, add kidney beans, canned tomatoes, chili powder, and cumin, let it thicken. Pour a cornbread batter over the top. Cornmeal, flour, egg, milk. Bake at 400 degrees for 25 minutes. The recipe had circulated in American cookbooks since the 1930s, when Midwestern agricultural extension pamphlets recommended it as a practical way to stretch inexpensive ground beef. By the 1960s, it appeared in budget cookbooks nationwide, often noted as makes 2 meals. The genius was the crust. It absorbed the chili juices from below while baking, so the bottom was dark and moist and spiced while the top stayed dry and crisp. 2 completely different textures in the same dish. You had to decide which half you wanted first. Both choices were right, and you never quite made up your mind before the dish was empty. If you grew up in Texas, this dish required no occasion. It appeared in a 9x13 pan at every church supper and gathering from the 1960s onward. King Ranch chicken has a murky origin that the actual King Ranch in South Texas has always declined to claim. But by the time it spread through community cookbooks and church pamphlets across the state, it had become one of the defining one-dish meals of Texas home cooking. Torn corn tortillas go in a loose layer. Not stacked tight, they need room to absorb. Shredded chicken and a mixture of cream of chicken soup, cream of mushroom soup, Rotel diced tomatoes with green chilies, and sour cream go over that. Another tortilla layer, another filling layer, then cheddar and Monterey Jack across the top. 350, 45 minutes. The Rotel is the key. The green chili heat cutting through the sour cream and double soup, making the whole dish taste more deliberate than a collection of cans has any right to. Number 13. The beef stew blue plate. Chuck roast cut into cubes, browned in a heavy pot, then simmered for 3 hours with potatoes, carrots, celery, and onions in a thick brown gravy. A bowl with bread cost $1.10 in 1966. The chuck roast was the cheapest cut in the butcher case, but 3 hours of slow cooking broke down every bit of tough connective tissue until the meat fell apart at the touch of a fork. Diner cooks started the stew at 6 in the morning and served it at lunch. By the time it hit the bowl, the broth had reduced into something so rich it looked almost black. The potatoes had absorbed the beef flavor. The carrots had turned sweet. Time was the ingredient that no drive-thru could afford. The trick with tomato soup rice was that you never added plain water. You poured condensed Campbell's directly into the skillet with a cup of long-grain rice, diced onion, a strip of green pepper, and enough chicken broth to make the ratio right, then covered it and left it on low for 20 minutes. The rice absorbed everything, the tomato, the salt, the sweetness of the onion, and came out a pale orange red, each grain separate, faintly sticky at the edges. The people who grew up eating this called it Spanish rice, even though no one in Spain would have recognized it, and every household had a different version. Some added ground beef, some used beef broth, some added diced tomatoes alongside the soup. The version made with nothing but soup and rice cost almost nothing and kept in the refrigerator for 3 days. It appeared in 1960s budget cookbooks under meatless main dishes with the suggestion to stretch it by adding a poached egg on top. Most people just ate it plain, standing at the stove. But stuffed bell peppers were a Depression-era solution to making ground beef and rice feel like more than ground beef and rice. You halved the peppers and they became free vessels, grown in the backyard or bought for pennies, and the same modest filling suddenly had shape and occasion. Raw ground beef mixed with uncooked rice, onion, salt, and tomato sauce, packed into the pepper halves, stood upright in a baking dish with a half-inch of water and more sauce poured over the top. Covered at 350, the steam inside did all the work. Rice cooked from trapped moisture, beef set firm, the pepper wall softened to tender. During the 1930s, when beef cost around 18 cents a pound and garden peppers came free all summer, this was the dish that made a weeknight feel like a real meal. Your grandmother may have served 2 halves with a glass of milk and nothing else. That was enough. She knew it was, and she set the table the same way regardless. Number 14. Stuffed peppers. Green bell peppers hollowed out and filled with ground beef, rice, tomato sauce, and onion, then baked until the pepper softened and the filling bubbled. Every diner in the Midwest and the Rust Belt served stuffed peppers as a blue plate special at least once a week from the 1940s through the 1970s. A plate with 2 peppers and bread cost $1 in 1968. The recipe came from Eastern European immigrants. Hungarian, Polish, and Czech families brought it to factory towns in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and it spread from kitchen tables to diner counters because it was cheap, it was filling, and it used the same 5 ingredients every working family already had. Stuffed peppers said you could take the simplest things in the cupboard and make something that looked like you had actually tried. That mattered in a diner. Presentation mattered. When frozen dinners and fast food gave people quicker options, stuffed peppers were one of the first dishes to leave the blue plate board. Not because they were expensive, not because they were difficult, because they took 45 minutes in the oven, and America had decided it could no longer wait that long for supper. The foods that required waiting were almost always the foods worth eating. That patience is something we traded away and never got back. The stuffed bell pepper was the dinner that looked like effort. One green pepper, top cut off and seeds shaken out, packed with seasoned ground beef and raw rice, nestled upright in a saucepan. A can of tomato soup poured over it. Lid on. Simmered 45 minutes until the pepper went soft and the rice cooked through inside the meat. One pepper was exactly the right amount for one person, and it looked, on a plate, like someone had thought it through. The pepper cost about 5 cents. The ground beef cost maybe 20. A meal under 30 cents that looked considerably more intentional. She always made two, though, even when it was just her. One for dinner, one kept warm on the back of the stove in case someone stopped by. Nobody stopped by. The second pepper went into the refrigerator and she ate it for lunch the next day. Alone, which was not the same as having made it for someone and always would be. Red beans and rice on Monday was not a recipe in New Orleans, it was a calendar fact. Monday was wash day, requiring hours of labor, so Monday dinner had to take care of itself. Beans into the pot in the morning, smoked sausage added by noon, rice going in late, everything collapsing into a thick sauce with very little oversight. The oven version carries the same logic. Soaked dried kidney beans, sliced smoked sausage, long grain rice, and spiced chicken broth, cayenne, garlic powder, a bay leaf, covered at 325 for 2 hours. The sausage bleeds smoke into the broth, the rice absorbs from below, and the beans thicken the liquid until what started as separate components becomes something close to gumbo. The Monday red beans tradition is documented to the mid-19th century in New Orleans and was common throughout Gulf Coast African-American households where smoked pork and dried legumes were the most affordable proteins available year-round. The dish does not need watching. It just needs time. Number 25. The Blue Plate Special Meatloaf. There was a diner in Akron, Ohio, where a woman named Edna Kowalski served the same meatloaf every Thursday from 1952 until she retired in 1989. Ground beef, breadcrumbs, an egg, ketchup on top. The plate came with mashed potatoes, green beans, and a roll. The whole thing cost $1.10 in 1970. Nobody asked for the recipe because everybody already knew it. Your mother made it. Your aunt made it. The woman at the church potluck made it. Meatloaf was the great equalizer of American cooking. It did not matter if you were a steel worker or a school teacher. You sat at the same counter and ate the same slab of seasoned ground beef with the same brown gravy ladled over the top. Diners stopped serving it because they decided it was not sophisticated enough. That was the whole reason. Not the taste, not the cost. The embarrassment of serving something that simple. Franks and beans was the dinner you made when the clock said 6:30, the wallet said empty, and the skillet was already on the burner before your coat was off. You opened a can of Van Camp's pork and beans, always Van Camp's, the sauce thicker than any store brand, sliced your Oscar Mayer wieners on the diagonal, added brown sugar and a squeeze of yellow mustard, and in 10 minutes had something smelling like a cookout for 30 cents. The trick was heat. Too high and the beans scorched to the bottom. Low and slow, lid half on, until the sauce thickened and the hot dog swelled and split at the edges. You ate it from the pan sometimes, crackers instead of a fork. Nobody was watching. That's the part nobody tells you about cooking alone. The freedom of it, the lack of theater. By the 1970s, frozen dinners brought the competition, and Franks and beans quietly left the table. The skillet that made it went to an estate sale with everything else. The smell of salmon patties hit you before you were fully inside, warm and oceanic, meaning someone was making something out of nothing. Canned pink salmon, bones left in because they were soft enough to eat, and every mother insisted they were good for you, got flaked with crumbled saltines, 1 egg, a spoonful of yellow mustard, and dried onion flakes. Shaped with wet hands into a skillet where Crisco was already shimmering. 2 minutes aside, 3 if you wanted the crust darker. The outside turned copper penny brown. The inside stayed barely warm at center. Tartar sauce if you had it, ketchup if you didn't. A whole generation kept a can of salmon in the back of the cabinet the way they kept a $20 bill in a shoe. Not for every day, but for when everything ran out. Canned salmon cost under 40 cents in the early 1960s. The patties made from it tasted like a cook who knew what to do with 40 cents. Most of those cooks are gone now, and the cans in the back of the cabinet have been gathering dust. She never diluted the soup. That was the thing most people got wrong when they tried to copy it. They thinned the can, and the noodles came out swimming instead of coated. The real method: bone-in chicken thighs straight into the casserole dish, dry egg noodles scattered around them without pre-cooking, and the cream of mushroom soup poured undiluted, the whole thick can, over the top, then cover tight. By the time the oven finished, the noodles had pulled up every bit of that condensed soup and the chicken skins rendered fat. Campbell's began publishing casserole recipes from their condensed soups in 1941, and this dump-and-bake logic became the foundation of how a generation of women fed families without measuring and without writing anything down for whoever came after. You can follow the method exactly. Whatever she added, the decision to leave the skin on, the extra crack of pepper before the foil went down, went with her, and no amount of trying will bring it fully back. Number 16. The patty melt. A beef patty cooked on the flat top, placed on grilled rye bread with caramelized onions, and a slice of Swiss cheese melted over everything. It was not a hamburger. It was not a grilled cheese. It was something better than both. The patty melt was invented at Tiny Nailers in Los Angeles in the 1950s. It spread across the country within a decade because it was the perfect diner food. Fast to cook, cheap to make, impossible to mess up. The Swiss cheese melted into the onions and the beef, creating a single unified bite where you could not tell where one ingredient ended and another began. A patty melt cost $1 in 1970. By 2000, most diners had replaced it with a regular cheeseburger because the rye bread was an extra item to stock. Efficiency killed the patty melt. Not taste, not demand. Inventory management. Pick one from this list and make it this week. The baked beans, the beef pot pie, the creamed spinach. Set a place at the table, sit down, and eat it the way people used to, on a real plate with a real fork. Tell me in the comments which Automat meal you remember or which one you want to try first. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.